The coming weeks, these past virtual chapters will be hosting various Microsoft speakers from the engineering and technical marketing teams who are going to discuss new functionalities and a lot of the enhancements in SQL Server 2014. Before we get started today, though, I do want to share some information about PASS and tell you more about our brand new high availability and disaster recovery virtual chapter and some of our upcoming future meetings. Okay, for those of you that may be new to this HA&DR virtual chapter, let me just take a moment to introduce you to PASS. PASS is the Professional Association for SQL Server, and it's an independent, non-for-profit organization run by and for the SQL Server community. PASS's membership is growing. We've got more than 100,000 members worldwide now. It's an organization that supports data professionals who use the Microsoft Data Platform to connect, share, and learn through virtual chapters, offering free online training such as this one, in-person events including the SQL PASS Summit, the Business Analytics Conference, and regional events including SQL Saturdays and the SQL Rally. For those of you interested, please visit the PASS website at sqlpass.org to figure out more. Now, as a valued member of this HA&DR virtual chapter, we're going to extend a $150 discount to the upcoming PASS Business Analytics Conference taking place this May 7th to 9th in San Jose, California. Just use the discount code BAVC23 when you register. The conference offers over 70 sessions by the world's top business intelligence and business analytics experts and over 20 hours of networking opportunities with 1,000 data professionals from around the world. It's a really, really great event. You're going to walk away with real-world insights from companies such as Microsoft, Wells Fargo, SurveyMonkey, Yahoo, and Intuit, as well as best practices, prescriptive guidance, and strategic vision. I definitely recommend you go learn more today over at passbaconference.com. Okay, the next meeting that we're going to have, we meet every month, the second Tuesday at 1 o'clock Eastern for a 1-hour session. If this is your first chapter session, please make time to go check us out every month. There's a lot more every month if you go to the virtual chapter list at sqlpass.org. It's great. The next meeting is going to be Tim Radney, so no backups, no recovery on May 13th at 1 o'clock Pacific Eastern. And now I'd like to introduce Gregory Leak, who's going to talk to us about backup to the cloud. So Greg is the product manager at SQL Server for Microsoft. He's been at Microsoft for 20 years. The guy has got a heavy concentration on the Azure relational database services. And he's got a lot of experience in field and customer technical readiness. The guy's also worked on a lot of other cool stuff over at Microsoft, .NET Framework, Visual Studio, Azure, and MSN. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Greg.
Great. Thank you very much, David. Let's see if I can take over as presenter here. I'm going to show my screen.
There you go.
Thank you again. Yeah, my name's Greg Leak. I'm a technical product manager on the SQL Server team. And as I share my screen, let's go ahead and hide our meeting. And I'm going to talk about some new features in SQL Server backing up to the cloud and why you might want to do it, how you can do it, and some new features that we've enabled in SQL Server 2014. But the good news is if you're not using SQL Server 2014, I'm also going to talk about the fact that we released a tool that will enable this functionality all the way back to SQL Server 2005, and I'm going to show that off as well. So while we continue to integrate Azure capabilities into our new product releases, and you'll see some of that integration when I show the new SQL Server Management Studio, we want to make sure that certain features obviously can work with prior releases of our technology. So keep that in mind if you haven't upgraded yet to SQL Server 2014. So we've already gone through my background. I've been on the SQL Server team just for a couple of years. I'm not the backup expert, but I'm going to do justice to the topic and also point you at some great resources. And then when we get to Q&A, if I can't answer a question, I'm going to point you at our technical product manager who actually owns this topic because he's off in San Francisco right now because we just did a big launch event with our new CEO down in San Francisco yesterday, so he's still down there. Okay, with that said, let's go ahead and get started. The three key technologies that I'm going to cover here in terms of backup to cloud are a feature called backup to URL that actually first went live in SQL Server 2012, but was only T-SQL enabled. There was no graphical user interface. Then I'm going to talk about the backup to Microsoft Azure tool, which is a free download that will work with SQL Server 2005, 2008, 2008 R2, 2012, and 2014. So we can go all the way back to SQL Server 2005 with that. And then I'm going to talk finally a little bit about something called managed backup. You might refer to this also, or heard it referred to as smart backup to Microsoft Azure. Notice also that I'm going to say several times Windows Azure, but we officially renamed the platform to Microsoft Azure because, of course, it's all not just Windows and .NET, but also Linux images and VMs and Java programming, PHP, etc. So it's not just Microsoft technologies. Azure's really quite an open platform. Okay, so with that said, target audience, IT pros. Perhaps some of you are using Azure in virtual machines. Maybe not. That's certainly not really a prereq. But I'm gonna pretty much assume that there's low familiarity with Azure. So that's just kind of, you know, at the upshot, that's kind of my going in assumption here. And I've pointed you here in these links to two great Microsoft Virtual Academy training courses where you can get some deep dive information not only on our hybrid capabilities, integrating SQL Server with the Azure Cloud, but also just on drill down on mission critical performance in all our new SQL Server 2014 in-memory technologies and high availability technologies. So these are two really good links for you to explore where there's training sessions offered on Virtual Academy. Okay, so SQL Server, backup to Azure. First of all, let me just do a brief overview of the Azure platform, because certainly what the feature that I'm going to talk about for SQL Server is just really scratching the surface of what Azure is all about. And if we were to take a high-level overview of the Azure platform all up, we would kind of start, I guess if we started on the bottom here, we've introduced several new data centers. So the Azure data centers now operate around the world, 4 in the US, 2 in Europe, and I believe now we have 5 in various parts of Asia, including two data centers that were just introduced in Japan, new data center in China, and actually 2 data centers will be coming online in Australia in the very near future as well. So it truly is a worldwide platform, and when you choose to host a storage account such that you might be using for storing your SQL Server backups in terms of this session today, or host a database, an Azure SQL database, or a VM, maybe running SQL Server, you choose the data center and the location that you want to put that resource. However, with that said, and I'll talk about this in a second, everything about Azure is designed by default for disaster recovery and failover scenarios. So across storage, compute, even IaaS capabilities, we can fail over across data centers, and you can set up specific technologies in Azure to have disaster recovery between multiple Azure data centers, such that if there's an earthquake or a flood in one of our data centers, you get that failover to the secondary Azure data center. I guess that the three, if we go the next layer up, we see compute, storage, and networking. Compute is all about running your apps, you know, the middle tier, the apps that are going to be talking to your database. And at this level, I would highlight virtual machines. This is straight up IaaS, infrastructure as a service capability. You can very easily go in and spin up a VM in Azure. We have pre-built images that already have SQL Server 2014, 2012 installed, and blank images. We've got images that have, we have a partnership with Oracle. Hate to bring that up in this chapter, but I will. You can actually spin up VMs with Oracle pre-installed as well. And of course, in a VM, you can install any software you want because it's your VM. It just lives in our data center, so we're responsible for the infrastructure and the SLAs around that VM. And we do have a 99.95% uptime SLA offered on our VMs. When you choose a VM, you choose a VM of various sizes. The smallest is kind of a shared environment. Then you can get dedicated resources today up to 8 cores and 56 gigabytes of RAM, but those images will be much larger shortly. And so if you think about database workloads, the cloud and the Azure platform are becoming much more apropos with every new upgrade we make in our data centers to running larger and larger database workloads. In fact, we have images that are actually optimized now for data warehousing that you can select right from our Azure Management Portal if you want to spin up SQL Server on Azure pre-optimized for data warehousing in the cloud. Okay, so the compute layer, virtual machines, websites is exactly what it sounds. Very easy to spin up websites, whether they're ASP.NET, JSP, or PHP websites are all supported. Mobile services, very easy to create back-end REST services that would then access your database. And then cloud services are kind of a automatic platform as a service offering for hosting websites or NT services, back-end business logic essentially that automatically, as with the other PaaS services, gets load balanced across however many VMs that you care to spin up. So across all the PaaS services, the light blue under compute, if you might start with a website with one VM and you need to scale, well, you can scale to hundreds of VMs, and the load balancing is automatically handled by the Azure platform. In fact, we have introduced a service in Azure that actually does dynamic scale that will monitor utilization levels that you set and thresholds, and will automatically, at peak times a day, for instance, spin up more VMs and then spin them automatically back down, so you get this elastic scale and you're only paying for what you need. Okay, for today's session, storage is going to be a critical topic. So on the storage side, I've highlighted both Azure SQL Database. This is a platform as a service offering that is based on SQL Server, where you can very easily create a database up in the cloud that automatically gets high availability with 3 primary and 2 online replicas. I'm not going to cover that in this session, but it is an apropos topic for this chapter because high availability and disaster recovery are actually built into Azure SQL Database. Table store is a NoSQL store. This is SQL PaaS, so I'm not going to talk about NoSQL store, but there is one in Azure. And then finally, what we call blob storage, but I increasingly just refer to as Azure storage. This is where your backups for SQL Server would go in this topic. So this is an underlying service that is just a fundamental service for Azure, for, just think of it as a file system in the cloud for storing either things that are publicly addressable or private that require encryption keys for only, authenticated access to. So you get to choose when you create storage accounts what you can put in there. Storage is incredibly important for the Azure platform because this is where not only would you store backup, but you might store images for your website, streaming video, pretty much anything that you would want to store up in the Azure platform. And then finally, networking. This is important because while today's session I'm talking about taking backups and just putting them in Azure storage, a lot of people ask, well, what if I want to run my database in Azure? And I'll say that's fine. You can either do that with virtual machines. As I mentioned, we have images with SQL Server pre-installed, or you can use Azure SQL Database, so that's the platform as a service offering. But a lot of companies will say, well, some of my databases can go to the cloud, but some of them, for privacy or compliance reasons, I really can't put in the cloud today, and maybe never. And so it turns out that we have enabled basically site-to-site VPN in Azure via something called Virtual Network that allows you to run your apps up in the cloud but securely connect back to your corporate data center, your on-premises data center, for instance, to continue to use your on-prem SQL Server SAP installation or whatever database that might be. And it just, at that point, Azure just looks like essentially an extension to your own corporate network where your apps might be running up in the Azure cloud, taking advantage of all that elasticity and saving all the infrastructure costs, but your database might actually remain on-premise. And actually, with that said, we actually also enable disaster recovery using Always On, where your primary SQL Server database is on-premise, but we would then be able to, once you set it up, have that fail over in case there's a disaster in your data center, fail over automatically to an always-on availability group secondary that's running up in one or more Azure data centers, because you can actually have multiple secondaries across multiple Azure data centers. So that's another key disaster recovery scenario for SQL Server using Azure as your disaster recovery data centers. Okay, so I'm not going to go into all the top levels because that's more about building apps and a little bit less about data, although I should probably point out from a big data side, we have Azure HD Insight, which is a Hadoop distribution, and so it's very easy to spin up Hadoop clusters up in the Azure cloud as well. All right, so that's a kind of a level set on the Azure platform. Let's dig into backup. Okay, first I want to talk about Azure storage. Everything I mentioned in Azure is basically designed to assume failure. And it really needs to be to offer a really solid, public cloud platform. Storage specifically is important for this topic because it's Azure Storage that you'll be moving your backups to if you want to take advantage of the features that I'm going to talk about. And I just wanted to kind of level set on what Azure Storage architecture looks like. When you store a file in Azure Storage, whether that's a data drive attached to one of your IaaS VMs or just a blob store where you're storing your SQL backups, for instance, within the data center, that's actually triple written to different availability regions within the data center. So there's triple replicacy within a data center. By default, every Azure Storage account also does geo redundancy, and that means that every file written into Azure Storage is also written to a secondary data center in another separated region. Hence, if you have failure or outage in one of our data centers, those files are still there available, and that failover happens automatically, taken care of by the Azure Fabric. We introduced something recently. It used to be that geo redundancy was there, but you couldn't use the secondaries to read files. We just introduced the ability to also offload perhaps some of your read-only work and access those secondary regions as essentially like a read replica. But this is just for files, not necessarily just for the database. So it's all about making sure that this is rock solid platform for failover, not just within a data center but across data centers. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the features. We introduced something called backup to URL actually in SQL Server 2012. And this was T-SQL enabled only, so you had to kind of go up on MSDN and you could run the T-SQL syntax that would essentially, instead of doing a file-based backup, redirect that file-based backup up into Azure Storage, and then also there's the restore complementary functionality for restoring directly out of Windows Azure Storage on-premise databases. So, of course, in SQL Server 2014, we've taken that to the next level, and that's really what I'm going to talk about in these three topics in this conversation. The key points here are, number one, this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with hosting your SQL Server in Azure. You can certainly do that, but this capability works great with all your existing on-premise databases. So you're just taking advantage of Windows Azure Storage, much like you might take advantage of shipping backups off to a bank vault or somewhere off-site for your disaster recovery plan. The difference is, of course, once you put it in Windows Azure Storage, we're giving you some really key failover scenarios that I just covered, and that it's triple redundant within a data center and then also automatically geo-redundant for you. And storage is very cheap in Windows Azure. In fact, the prices continually come down. It's a competitive space with folks like Amazon and now Google in the space as well. And so you get advantage of that competition because the Azure storage is basically bottomless. It's just the size of these data centers and the number of objects that we have stored. I think we announced yesterday on our launch event that there's over like 5 trillion objects already stored in Azure storage. And you can create multiple storage accounts in multiple regions, create containers, which are essentially, think of it as the file system, and those would be folders, and just store basically any amount of information. And that's important for backup, because probably one of the scenarios that a lot of customers run into is that their disk arrays become full. They're doing some sort of maintenance plan that's automated, and their transaction log backups and/or their full database backups eventually start to eat up all their on-prem storage. When you go to Azure, it really is limitless storage up in the cloud. Now, I mentioned the off-site geo-redundancy. You don't have to provision hardware or storage. It's all done automatically. You don't have to manage the devices. We provide the SLA on the storage, and you get this great remote accessibility. So Azure storage accounts, there's various containers that you can use to move files, download files, upload files, including the HTML5 Azure Management Portal. So, of course, you can access all this from any platform, iPad, iOS, Linux, Windows, it doesn't matter. It's just a REST API call that you're essentially making either over HTTP or HTTPS, or using a tool that does that in terms of managing access to the remote storage up in the data centers. Okay, so what this is showing is SQL Server T-SQL construct. And so the first way that you can do this, take backups of SQL Server to Windows Azure Storage, is good old T-SQL, which is probably what most people will end up using. And this just shows some of the syntax here. So basically, you'll have a credential. You'll associate that with a storage account, which is your storage account. All storage accounts have access keys, which I'll show in just a second. And then you'll issue that backup to the URL. And so you're redirecting that from your local file system. You're now going over our REST APIs directly to the Azure Data Center to store or restore your database from the Azure Data Center. We enable compression. That's key because typically when you're going from on-prem to an Azure Data Center, of course, you're going through your proxy servers over the internet, over a secure channel, of course. It is HTTPS, but there still is network latency involved, and I'll show a little bit about the performance you can expect out of this, but that's something to keep in mind. So compression is key, making those large backups as small as possible by enabling compression. And we also enable encryption, and this is a key feature actually introduced in SQL Server 2014, which I'll show, and it's probably been one of the most customer requested features that we added, maybe a little bit late in the cycle. Maybe should have been added a few releases before, but the ability to encrypt your backup files where you keep your unencrypted credentials on premise. Even though your backup is going to Azure, only you own the credentials, potentially the certificate decrypt credentials on-prem, so that nobody else can crack into your backup file. It's completely encrypted based on the algorithm that you choose. And you can choose to turn on or off both encryption and compression depending on how you want to set things up. Okay, so one note is I mentioned kind of the latency. So if you're going from an on-prem box and doing your backups up to Azure Storage, of course you're going to have that internet latency. If you're actually already running SQL Server in Azure VM and you're in the same data center as your storage account, you won't have that latency because everything's over the local data center, incredibly high-speed network that's within the data center. So there's some, basically you don't take any profit whatsoever if SQL Server is already up in Windows Azure and you're backing up to Azure Storage, because that's all on the local network, not going over the internet. Okay, so T-SQL. There's a construct. Everybody's familiar with T-SQL. You can kind of get a sense for what that looks like. I'll point you in a second to an MSDN site that gives you examples and all the different things that you can do. This is just one simple example. But T-SQL, it turns out, is not the only way that you can trigger these backups from SQL Server to Azure. The next way is via SMO, so SQL Management Objects. So here's a little C# code using SMO that's triggering the same thing, just in a different way, using .NET code in this case, and using SMO against SQL Server. And then that's not the only way. Many of you probably use PowerShell. And so we also enable the same functionality via commandlets that are built into Azure PowerShell that you can download for SQL Server. And so here's an example PowerShell script that is doing exactly the same thing, but just showing the PowerShell features. So when I go into demo mode here in a minute, I'm going to show the Azure Management Portal. One thing that's really important to note, and this is how the PowerShell stuff works, is that everything in Azure that I might do in the Management Portal is got a REST API behind it. So there's a secure REST API. And that means you can programmatically do all sorts of management tasks, whether that's creating VMs, tearing down VMs, installing software on VMs, creating Azure SQL databases, creating storage accounts, deleting. All of that can be done not only graphically in the HTML5 management console, but can be done programmatically via the REST APIs from any platform. And of course, we also have a CLI command line interface as well. And in this case, I'm showing the PowerShell, but you could be running CLI interfaces on other platforms besides Windows. So it's really a very interesting environment with a very rich management interface for you DBAs and developers that obviously probably don't do a lot graphically. You probably drive things and want to drive things programmatically for productivity and automation's sake. Okay, so those are the three options for backup to URL. Let's talk a little bit about performance. This slide is an interesting slide, and I'll have to explain it a little bit. Let's assume that you're on-prem, okay, so you're not in a SQL Server instance running already in an Azure VM, because in that case you're not going to have any network latency. It's all within the data center. But if you are doing an on-prem scenario backing up to Microsoft Azure, you are going to have that network latency, both through your, obviously, things going through your proxy servers outbound, and then also the network hop over to the Azure data center. Everything's over a secure channel, but you still have that network latency that's going to be there. So what this slide is showing is, let's assume, if you look at the bottom, it says example backup size is 131.81 megabytes. So this is an actual benchmark that the engineering team has run, and they do this on various sizes. But assume that is a static, basically 131 megabyte backup. That's with probably compression already enabled, so the database might actually be a lot bigger. If you look at these charts across the bottom, let's start at the first one, backup time versus latency. So what the x-axis is showing is assuming you have this amount of latency in your network, the first being 10 milliseconds all the way up to 10,000 milliseconds, which is 10-second latency. This would be, for that particular backup size, the amount of time in seconds you would expect the backup to take, okay, going over that network. So you can see it's very constant up to about 1 second latency in the network, but then it does climb, okay? So it is dependent on the latency of the network. And then you see the same chart for restore time versus latency. And again, 1,000 on that chart is 1 second because it's in milliseconds. But the good news is up to about 1 second latency in the network from you to the Azure data center, it's very constant backup and restore times. After that, if you have greater latency in your particular data center, you're set up to the internet, you will see some larger backups taking larger amounts of time because of that latency. So that's just kind of a warning up front. And I've got some other limitations that I'll talk about at the end, because we want to make sure that you understand what works really well and how it's designed, and then things that you can't necessarily do yet in this first release. Okay, so that's a little bit about the performance. So let me go to demo here. I'm going to show a couple of things. Because I'm assuming newness to the Azure platform, I thought I'd just start with the Azure Management Portal. So this is the Azure Management Portal, HTML5. You can be on a Mac, PC, a tablet, whatever, it doesn't matter, it's just HTML5. And this is looking into my Azure subscription. And I've got a lot of stuff going on because I use it quite a bit for demos and all sorts of hosted applications. And I'm looking at all my items, but I'm going to go down here to the Storage tab. So on the left navigation, we see some of those elements I talked about up front, websites, VMs. In fact, just for kicks and giggles, I'll show you how easy it is to create a VM in Azure with SQL Server 2014 or previous version pre-installed. I just go from Gallery. Hopefully this is coming through for you. And you can see these are all the pre-built images we have. So right away, you can see all the SQL Server images. Literally, I just click on this wizard through 4 steps, and I've got a fully provisioned SQL Server Enterprise or Standard Edition instance running in an Azure VM. It's billed at a compute rate plus the SQL Server license, depending whether it's Standard or Enterprise, per hour. But if you have software assurance with Microsoft, you can take on-prem SQL Server licenses and bring your own to this virtual machine environment. I mentioned there's some Oracle images, so it's not just about all Microsoft products. And then you can create your own gallery of images. So you can actually create a pre-built image based on your SQL Server environment that you want your users to be provisioning up in Azure. And you can have your own corporate gallery of pre-built templates that are your Hyper-V VMs that will be hosted in Azure. So I just wanted to show that. I'll close out of that real quick. Let's get into storage. Just the file system in the cloud, if you will. So here I've got several storage accounts. If I wanted to create a new storage account, I could say New. I'd pick Storage and Quick Create. I would go ahead and create this has to be DNS addressable, so some sort of URL, and it'll actually do that DNS check immediately to make sure that over the REST APIs we can address that data center for that storage account. So you can see LGL are my initials, Lowell Gregory Leak. And that's actually available, but I bet if I type something like test, someone's already grabbed that. Yeah, you can see. So the obvious ones that probably have been taken for years already. And then you choose we'll go back to LGL since that was available. You choose your data center. So here are the locations that we have for your Azure data centers. I mentioned the ones in Asia, Europe, the 4 in the U.S. and then the 2 that we just added in Japan, and shortly we'll have a couple in Australia coming online as well. So you choose your region, and that's important because you want to have a region that's probably close to most of your users that are going to be using this functionality. And that is pretty important. There's a capability called the Content Delivery Network that will actually allow you to choose from not necessarily just from these data centers, but what we call front-end cache servers that are in a much wider variety of areas, such as South America, et cetera, where we can actually you can set up upfront caching of information that's in your storage subsystem such that local users automatically pull from a data center node, a front-end cache node that's much closer to them on the internet or geographically close to them for even better performance. So that's another feature. Okay, so I'm not going to create a new storage account now, but you can see it's really easy to do. If I go back to my storages, I'll look at one of my accounts that I've got running in North Central U.S. Data Center, and you get a dashboard. I don't have much going on in this. I think it's empty because I just created it or just cleaned it out. But you get some monitoring capabilities. Nothing's available here because I've got nothing in it, but it would show you access and things that are going on within that storage account. I can go to the Containers tab, and containers are just essentially folders. Just think of them as folders in a file system, and these is where you would actually store files, your blobs, if you will. Any type of file can be stored. So here I've got a container within this storage account called SQL Backups that I'm going to use for my particular demo, and I'm going to show you that there's absolutely nothing in it right now. Okay, so we'll start with that. One thing I did want to show also in terms of storage, where your SQL backups are going to be going, if I go back in here and go to Configure, I mentioned all those redundancy settings. So by default, we're geo-redundant between 2 data centers. You can also now turn on the read access to your secondary data center. And then you can turn off geo-redundancy if you don't want it. So this is all just configurable with these 3 basic tabs. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that you can do within storage, all sorts of stuff, logging and monitoring within the dashboard for your storage accounts. And again, your storage account, I mean, you can store petabytes of information. Many, it is bottomless storage essentially. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of the Azure Management Portal and my particular storage account I'm going to use here. And there's nothing in my SQL Backups container, so let's go do something interesting with SQL Server. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up SQL Server Management Studio 2014. So as you know, hopefully, as of April 1st, you can download SQL Server 2014 from MSDN. Eval version's available. It's GA'd. It's completely done. You can buy it through the channel, your resellers. It's all there now. So this is the new Management Studio. Now, of course, the new Management Studio can also talk to previous versions of SQL Server. It's not the management tools themselves, of course, can talk to 2014 as well as previous versions of SQL Server. But there's new capabilities in the Management Studio when you're connected to a SQL Server 2014 database. I just installed the RTM bits on my laptop, so I created a database that is a pretty easy database. It actually doesn't have anything in it right now, but for purposes of the demo, I've created a customer database. One thing I want to show you that's new in SQL Server 2000 Management Studio is I was over browsing through my storage container in the Management Portal. There are third-party tools, like Nudesic has a great tool that give you kind of a drag-and-drop GUI interface into Azure Storage. So you can get those for free or buy them from Nudesic or other partners. But we've done something pretty cool here directly within SQL Server Management Studio, which is not only can we connect to databases and, of course, analysis services, reporting, etc., but you'll notice we have this new little button here, Connect Management Studio directly to Azure Storage. So I'm going to do that. And what I've done here, since I've run through this demo already, if I was coming in for the first time, it would ask me for my storage account name, and then it would say, okay, we need to be able to do this securely. Everything has to be secure. So I need your storage account key to enable the secure access only via authorized use. So I'd then type in LGL Azure as my storage account and then hammer in the encryption key essentially into the account key. Where do you get that encryption key? You get it from the Management Portal. So if I go back into just my base storage for LGL Azure, go to the dashboard, you'll see right down at the bottom here, Manage Access Keys. If I was to click that, it's going to load up a primary as well as a secondary access key, and I can copy that to the clipboard. I could also regenerate it, so if I wanted to kind of say, uh-oh, someone got my key, I could actually make that previous key completely invalid and regenerate a new key. But in this case, I would just copy it to the clipboard and then paste it right in here to SQL Server Management Studio, which I've already done right here where it says account key. So that's pretty good. So I'll just hit connect. So really easy to get started here. And right within Azure Management Studio, I can see my container within that storage account. And of course, you can connect up to as many Azure storage accounts and containers that have many containers as you want. And we'll see that we're completely empty here. We don't have anything in it yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this customer database, which is running on-prem here. So I'm just running this on my laptop here in my home, actually, because I'm remote right now. And I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to say tasks. And of course, there's backup. Now, I'm going to quickly flip this. No, it's already there. Good. So this is what you'd normally see, which is backup to disk. And now you'll notice here in SQL Server 2014, I can flip this from backup to disk to backup to URL. Okay, so here is backup to URL. And I've created a SQL credential. I call it my Azure credential. If you haven't set one up yet, you just hit the create button, and then you would download essentially a publishing profile or a management certificate from the Azure portal and use that to create your access credential to your storage account. And then I'm going to put in here my Azure storage container, and that is SQL backups. Okay, and I think that is good. And then I want to show something really important. And you can see here's my URL reference, LGL Azure, that's the account name. And then it goes to the container SQL backups down here. But let's go to backup options, because this is really important. Okay, number one, set backup compression. Okay, so compress backup or do not compress backup, or just use the default base server setting. I might choose to use compression here. This is new, encrypt backup. I don't have a key set up. You have to actually have a certificate installed in SQL Server. I didn't do that yet. This is a new installation, but you would choose that asymmetric or certificate key and then choose your encryption algorithms, and these are the encrypt algorithms. The great thing here is that you can keep your certificate and your encryption keys on-prem, even though the backup, which is encrypted, goes to the public cloud, to Azure, and it's still secure, but you can actually keep your decrypt key on-prem so you have that complete kind of security conformance and assurance that nobody else can crack that backup file. Okay, so I'm not going to encrypt this because I don't have my certificate set up in SQL Server, but I'm just going to go, to backup option. I can just literally just hit OK now, and this is going to go execute through the wizard. Backup completed successfully. It's fast because it's an empty database. And then if we go here and refresh this, you'll notice I now have my backup automatically stored in Azure Storage with all that geo redundancy as well as local data center redundancy and obviously the bottomless storage in terms of the amount of stuff that I can store up there. So I've now offloaded all my on-prem storage, and I'm using Azure and all its capabilities for storing those backups, compressed and encrypted. Okay, I could see that obviously as well in the management portal. So I'm going to go back here, close out of this, and go into containers. And now if I go into the SQL backups container, we'll see that same blob. There's the backup file that I just took, and it's dated and given a kind of an automatic name. Now, I just drove that via the wizard, but of course, when you drive that via T-SQL or the PowerShell commands, you can customize the backup names and do all sorts of things in a very customized and automated fashion. So I'm just using the wizard here for the demo, but you can see that's built in. I can directly, I can actually add files into storage from Management Studio. I could delete this file if I wanted to right now just by hitting the delete button. So I'm not just getting a view in here to my Azure storage account from SQL Server Management Studio, but SQL Server Management Studio actually can go ahead and manipulate files within my storage accounts once I've securely connected up with the key that I showed. Okay, so let's see. That is a basic capability of just doing a quick backup. If I wanted to do a restore, I can just go ahead and say, let's restore a database, and you'll see the complementary, let's see, I think I go to device, and then I would choose the URL. I haven't done this particular demo. Just had this going. Let's see, device. There we go. File, nope, I'm going to choose URL. So I choose URL in my restore option, and then I can go ahead and add, and there it is. I've already done this once in prep for today's session, luckily. And there's my account key, and I can go ahead now and take the restore directly from Azure to my on-prem database. So there's kind of the complementary restore functionality to the backup functionality. Again, both this all can be driven programmatically, T-SQL or PowerShell. So I'll cancel. I don't really have to do a restore here, but you get the idea. Okay, so let's see. Was there anything else that I wanted to highlight right here? Now, I think I've shown that, the management portal. So let's go back to slides here and continue on, because that's just the first part of the capabilities. There's really 3 parts of the capabilities. That's part 1. If you're not using SQL Server, oh, let's talk about limitations. Only supports Windows Azure storage today, okay? So not local disk. So if you're using this particular backup to URL, it has to go to Windows Azure storage. It's not going to go, for instance, to your local disk or to other cloud providers today. That's limitation 1. It will do database backups and T-log backups, but it does not do differential backups. In Azure storage today, there's a 1 terabyte file size limit. So a single file in Azure storage can grow up to 1 terabyte. So you want to use backup compression. But if you're trying to, create a backup file that's 2 terabytes today, this will not work. Backup of system databases is not supported, so it's only today for user databases. Recovery models have to be set to full or bulk logged. Simple recovery model is not supported. There's no support for log shipping today. Database mirroring is only supported on Principal database. And for always on, we will support always on if you're using SQL Server in an Azure VM and all your replicas are also running up in Azure VMs. By design, if you've got some sort of tools that you're already using, there can be you want to make sure there's no conflicts with those. And today there's limited user action detection and mitigation on some of the steps. So it is what it is as a V1. A lot of these limitations will go away as we come out with updates to both Docs product and obviously our VM images up in Azure, but we just want to be upfront about some of the limitations in this model that exist today as of SQL Server 2014 just releasing. Okay, now I mentioned also that these are capabilities that are enabled directly for SQL Server 2014 and also 2012 databases. But what if you're still on our SQL Server 2008 or 2005 even? Well, we've got this great free download that also is released now. It released, I believe, on April 1st, so just a couple of weeks ago, and that's called the SQL Server Backup to Azure tool. You can find it really easily just by doing a Bing or Google search on this exact title, and you'll see the download link immediately. And in fact, let's just show that, because I think I have it here. Nope, I've got it here. Here's the download page. So it's a free download. Very easy. It takes 2 seconds to download. It's very lightweight. Okay, so back to slides real quick. This tool works, as I mentioned, with all those versions of SQL and adds this capability. It's a standalone tool, and the really kind of cool thing with this tool is it adds encryption capability to your backups for prior versions of SQL Server, because we just added that encryption feature for backups to 2014, right? But if you're using 2005 and want to stay on it, or R8 or 2012, this will actually let you encrypt your backups as well. And this tool does work with local storage, so you don't necessarily have to use this tool just to move files into the Azure cloud. It will also actually encrypt and you can use it on-prem just to encrypt your SQL Server backups. So those are the versions you can see that it supports, adds the encryption to prior versions, either local or if you're using it to redirect to the Azure cloud to store your backups. And it's really easy to configure. There's the download link right there. So I think I've got a demo that I want to show. For this demo, you'll notice I showed this already. I'm switching to a VM that's already running SQL Server. So notice down here I've got a remote desktop session to an Azure VM that I believe I have running in Asia somewhere that I set up just in 10 minutes prior to this session. And here's my VM that I'm remotely logged into. And you can see I have, well, let's go ahead and just get the tool up. I have the tool installed, okay, and running, and there's a UI to the tool. What you do with the tool, and you can see that I got SQL Server installed on this box. I use one of our pre-built images. And this is actually 2012, because I wanted to demonstrate that this tool works not just with SQL Server 2014, but with prior versions all the way back to 2005. So I've got SQL Server installed in my VM. This might be an on-prem box. It doesn't really matter where your SQL Server instance is running. And here is the Windows Azure Backup tool and the UI. And what you do is you create rules. I've already created a default rule, so I'm going to click Modify. You can create multiple rules. I'm going to go ahead and click Modify just to show you what your rules look like. So basically, you're going to take a path that you're going to put your backups into. And in this case, I've chosen C backups. I've created a folder on my C drive where I've created here backups, and this is the local OS drive for my VM, and I don't have any files in it. And that's my rule. So it's going to monitor that particular folder. And then I'm going to look for files of a particular extension. So you may have certain backups that you're going to use with a certain extension that you want to get shipped off to Azure, but if you use a different extension, you can just keep them on-prem. So you have some flexibility into what exactly gets shipped up into Azure or into your redirect location as well. So I've just chosen the standard .back implementation. You click Next. You give it the storage account name. I gave it my LGL storage account. You can see I've already put my encrypt key in, and then the container is SQL backups. And this will do a verify account to make sure that everything's set up. Account verification successful. I go to the next. I can choose encryption, and I can put in my encryption. The encryption algorithm here is AES-256, and then I have to put in a password for this particular encryption algorithm. But I'm not going to use encryption, but you can see how that works. I can enable or disable compression, which I've enabled, and I just click Finish, and my rule is the same. I could add multiple rules if I wanted to add a new one. Easy to do. So pretty self-explanatory there. This UI does not have to be running. Once you install the tool, it adds itself directly to the SQL Server instance, or within the OS as essentially a background service that's always running. So you can close this UI, and don't worry, it's still going to be running and everything's still going to be working, because obviously your server or VM might reboot, and the UI is just there to create your rules. So let's go test this out. I'm up in SQL Server Management Studio on my VM, and I've created a customer database, same kind of empty little database I had for my other demo. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the normal backup. All right, there's nothing. Obviously, this is SQL Server Management Studio 2012. It's not 2014, so I'm just going to get the normal backup dialog, and this could be 2005 or 2008, etc. And I'm just going to back up to disk. And let's see. Let's go ahead and notice that I'm creating the backup as C backup, so I'm backing up to that right folder that the rule is going to pick up, and I'm going to call this. Let's call it something different, actually. We'll just go through the UI here, so bear with me. We'll call it something more meaningful. There's my backups folder, and I'll call it demo customer db.back. Now I got to have that file extension because that's part of that particular rule, and I'll say OK. And I could go ahead and set all my options as normal. This is just the normal UI. And I'm showing the UI. Of course, you might be driving, and you probably are, your backups with T-SQL or other mechanisms. This will work just fine. As long as you hit this rule, it'll work just fine. So I'll go ahead and click OK. It's executing my backup. The backup's successful. So, of course, we would expect on local disk to see that backup, and there it is in my backups folder. But what I want to show you now is in the management portal, if I go to my storage account, and find that particular storage account and go to my containers and go to that backups container, you'll now see the demo customer DB. There's a manifest file that's the redirect, and then the actual data file. So you'll see two new files. The first file up here was what I did in the previous demo, but this file and third file are the actual backup files. And then the restore is just as straightforward as well. So that is, in a nutshell, the SQL Server backup tool for Azure. Works with everything from SQL Server 2005 all the way up to SQL Server 2014. It's a free download. You can just go and grab it today and start using it. Let's see. Let's go and take a look as well. We should see that if I refresh here in SQL Server Management Studio 2014. We'll see those files have been added to my storage account as well. Okay. All right. Let's go back to slides. And now let's cover the third functionality that we've enabled. In this case, this is 2014 specific. And this is something called Manage Backup to Azure, or sometimes referred to as Smart Backup. And this is intelligence built in to SQL Server via special stored procedure that is really geared to take, especially for, I would say, for non-tier 1 databases, but for small and medium businesses or work group and departmental level databases, allow you to kind of offload from your mind creating maintenance plans and worrying about backup and maintenance plans. And the reason I say not for tier 1, because by taking away the work of having to set up, all the maintenance plans and the low-level details, you lose some flexibility. And probably for your tier 1 databases, you probably don't want to lose that flexibility, because this is an algorithm that actually runs and does things in a very automated fashion. So at the outset, this is going to be something that you might use for a wide variety of your organization's databases, but probably not for all of your databases. And so this basically does a maintenance plan, an automated maintenance plan according to our algorithm for databases, backing them up into Azure automatically on an ongoing basis. So it's an agent that manages and automates your backup policy for either an entire SQL Server instance, whether that instance is on-prem or running in a Azure VM, or for that matter running in a VM on Amazon and EC2. It doesn't matter where your SQL Server runs, as long as it's 2014 in this case. And it automates this backup policy. So it gives you some flexibility and configuration, and you don't have to manage your backup policy for these databases. Very minimal knobs. It's context aware, so it does some very special things about understanding when to take a backup, when not to take a backup, how long your retention period is. So there's some smarts built into the algorithm, so that, for instance, it's not just being run on a schedule like every minute or 5 minutes or 10 minutes, as a lot of maintenance plans do. It will understand if you don't need a transaction log backup, nothing's been added to the database is untouched, it will understand it doesn't need to do another backup, okay? The intelligence is built in, including container and file naming, and the retention period, which I believe is up to 30 days today. User action detection is built in, and it leverages the restore and backup to URL functionality that I previously demonstrated. So again, once you get your backups and use this to set up the policy and the maintenance plan, those are getting shipped off to Azure Storage with its great geo-redundancy, cheap costs, zero hardware management, etc. So there's an example little script that you would run. You would set up your backup policy, giving it a database name in this case, in this T-SQL script, your retention period, and your credentials, and then some other parameters such as your encryption. And then the enable backup equals 1 means smart backups enabled for that database. Again, you can run this stored proc to set up smart backup for individual databases, but you can also run it at the instance level, in which case an entire SQL Server instance, all the databases within it, inherit this capability automatically. Okay. I know many of you will ask, okay, well, exactly what's it doing, and how often is it taking a backup? Okay, so here's the deal, the inside knowledge, at least in this V1 release. Every 15 minutes, it's at a minimum, every 15, and that's at a minimum, it will be doing a transaction log backup, so you can do point-in-time restores, and at a minimum, it will be doing a full database backup once a week. Okay, so basically a 15-minute is going to be your RTO, I guess. So that's basically how it's built today, and you cannot change that 15-minute interval today. But again, it doesn't necessarily do it every 15 minutes. It's smart and knows if it might need to, because of heavy traffic, do it less often, for instance. So it allows for large-scale management of a variety of different databases. Okay? This is kind of the algorithm loop, if you will, a nice little flow diagram. And again, the key thing is it's not just a time frequency-based maintenance plan. It's got these smarts built in. And there's some great documentation on MSDN where you can just look up this feature, Smart Backup or Manage Backup on Azure, and read through the T-SQL documentation, etc., and understand exactly how it works. So it basically says, is it on for the database? Yes. Is the backup chain broken? Is a backup due? It goes through this algorithm, this loop, and this main loop is always executing. And so it's a full automated backup maintenance plan. that makes it really easy to set up for, a wide variety of databases. Does some smart throttling that you can see. It staggers log backups, etc. So there's a lot of smarts built into the algorithm. Built-in intelligence in terms of file retention. Minimum is 1 day, maximum is 30 days. And it does these loops and is looking at your storage account and monitoring what's going on in terms of both the transaction log backups and the full database backups that it's taking and managing for you. Okay, and I think the second point is self-explanatory. So if I wanted to show that, I actually did want to show that because I got a demo slide here. I'll quickly pop into demo, and what I'm going to do is pull up SQL Server Management Studio 2014 that we've been in here, and I'm going to show. You can, of course, set this up just via T-SQL. It's just a stored procedure, and all that documentation's up on MSDN. But we have actually set up in SQL Server Management Studio 2014 a graphical way to set this up. So if you go into the Management tab in Enterprise Edition in SSMS 2014, there's something called Manage Backup. You can see the Manage Backup tab. I haven't set it up yet on this machine, but I'll go ahead and double-click that. Whoops, actually you've got to, I just figured that out, you've got to right-click and say Configure. So I'll right-click and say Configure. I've pumped up my font so my wizards look a little funny, but I wanted to make sure you all could see it over the webcast. And here you can configure it and enable it. I can configure my retention period. I'd have to give it a credential, obviously, to my Azure storage account, which I previously created, so I could use that. And I could choose my encryption and my encryption algorithm here for just like I do with the backup to URL that I started with. So here's a handy-dandy GUI way of setting up Manage Backup. And again, you can do this at this is going to do it at the instance level, but you can do it via T-SQL at the database level. So some of your databases are using Manage Backup, and some of them might not be on that SQL Server instance. Okay, so let's go back to slides. Just a quick demo there. And I'm going to give you these key takeaways in closing here. Backup to URL via T-SQL is already in SQL Server 2012. But we've added a ton of functionality in 2014, including wizards and GUI interfaces within SQL Server Management Studio, as well as some of the new functionality like the manage backup that I just showed that are unique to 2014. The backup to cloud tool, though, lets you do some pretty cool things with versions all the way down to SQL Server 2005 using Azure Storage, adding the encryption capability to backups, even if you're just using the tool with a local storage and not even using Azure Storage. So that's the second thing that I covered. And then the third thing is the manage backup to Windows Azure, which really creates a maintenance and backup management plan and automates that for databases where you can take advantage of that automated functionality. You don't necessarily need really low-level control. I'm going to point you at two great resources. These are Virtual Academy. So if you're just to go to microsoftvirtualacademy.com and go into the SQL Server tab right on the main screen, you'll find a variety of newer courses. Some of them are new, and you're going to actually have to click into 2 additional courses. There's like a link, and these are the links for that we did, which are like 8 hours worth of training just on hybrid capabilities, and another 8 hours on the new mission critical and in-memory technologies in SQL 2014. And then before I close, what I've covered here is backup to Azure. There's another, since this is the disaster recovery and HA chapter, there's another key capability in SQL Server 2014 that we've enabled, which is always-on replicas or always-on availability groups that span on-premise databases to Azure data centers, and I think I brought that up. But that's if you're using always-on for HA, where you're doing like synchronous or asynchronous replication between primary and multiple secondary nodes. We built into SQL Server 2014 the ability to span from an on-prem primary database to have secondary replicas running up in the Azure cloud, and there's a wizard that helps that helps you set that up, etc. So that's another HA disaster recovery technology beyond just the backup technologies that I've covered today. So with that said, I guess I hand it back to David, if I can. Let's see if I can do that.
You bet.
I'll stop presenting. All right.
Okay. John and I are going to go through the handful of questions that we have for you.
Okay.
John, if you want to go ahead and do the first one.
We'll see how I do on these, by the way. If I can't answer them, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send out my email link so that you can email them to me and I get them to the right engineer or Darmati who can answer them maybe better than I can. But let's shoot. Let's see what I can do.
Sure.
Go
So
ahead.
the very first one, Greg, is does Microsoft have a definition for its outage that it uses to verify that it's 99.95 uptime compatible with SLAs? Is there anything you can share towards showing how they come to those numbers?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. We do it in a certain way. Amazon does it in a certain way. We do some base level monitoring. Well, we'll give you on your subscription some automated notifications, but you've got to read the SLA. I don't really have an easy answer for that, and you have to actually. I would recommend you go to Azure.com, and for any of the services that have an SLA attached, which is just about every one, I would recommend you drill into that SLA because the SLA in many cases is, well, the SLA will spell out exactly what that policy is and exactly what your recourse is. And typically your recourse is a discount on your Azure credits for that day. What we have done is we've added, well, we've actually just launched in preview a new management portal that shows you, it's actually very cool, the service status for every Azure service and every data center and whether it's running or not. We haven't had a major outage in a while. They do happen, but you have to refer to the specific SLA for the service, whether it's VM, SQL database, storage, and those are all published on windowsazure.com, so that's where I'd refer you.
Excellent. So for the next question, is backup encryption required for you to go through and do these backups out to Azure? Do you need to use TDE? Does that have to be enabled?
No, that's had nothing to do with TDE. TDE might be enabled or might not be enabled. So this is just taking the backup file, whether it's, the database might be encrypted by default if you've got TDE turned on. Transparent data encryption is TDE. That's fine, but even if it's not encrypted in SQL Server and you're not using TDE, this will work just fine. It actually takes the file and then encrypts the actual file is what's going on based on the mechanism you choose, and you can see there's different encryption algorithms that you can choose from.
Excellent. Keeping with encryption here, in your demo where you used the tool for versions older in 2012, when you did your backup that was local and also went out to Azure, was encryption used for both the local on-premise and also Azure? And if so, what encryption?
So you get to choose, well actually in that particular tool the algorithm is always AES 256 I think is the algorithm that tool supports. And so yes, it gets encrypted locally and then also what goes up to Azure is encrypted. So you could use that tool via that particular encryption mechanism to just do local backups that add encryption to SQL Server 2005 backups, for instance. So there's the capability to use that tool even if you're not going to use Azure Storage, just to kind of add the encryption feature that we added to 2014 to databases from 2005 to all the way up to 2012, because it's built into 2014 now.
Okay, and we have two more here. So the next one is, how are you able to configure retention policies with backup to Azure?
With managed backup to Azure? So on the retention policy side, if you're just doing backup to URL, okay, I'm going to punt on that I'm going to punt on that and get back to you on the answer for backup to URL. I don't know if that's automated on the retention policy or it's up to you to manage that. I'm not positive on that front. On the managed backup, the retention is just configured as one of the parameters to the smart backup configuration or stored procedure that sets it up. And there you literally just pass in a day ranging from 1 day to 30 days, and it manages that retention period for you. But I got to get back to you on the backup to URL because I'm not exactly positive whether there's a mechanism where the retention policy is automatically managed or not.
Sure, and the last question's a great one because I can answer it. So you're off the hook on the last one here.
Okay.
The question is, because Always On works with Windows Cluster and secondary replica has to be part of the cluster, how does this work in the cloud? And so the great answer to this, for anyone that's wondering the answer, is if you look on our virtual chapter website, Joey D'Antoni actually did an hour presentation that answers this direct question. So you could go to the archives there, click on the video, and get your answer there.
So we've already got a great presentation on that. Yeah, I mean, a lot of customers really, I mean, when we first launched Azure, and everybody's like, well, you know, the one scenario that they were first very initially interested in is using Azure for disaster recovery, because it makes a lot of sense in terms of, hey, we want to keep some things on-prem. Our on-prem data center ain't going away, but it sure is expensive for us to build out an entire data center in another part of the country or the world as our DR data center. Can't we set up some capabilities where we can actually use Azure as our DR data center? So we spent a lot of time over the past couple of years across a variety of tools, especially SQL Server, but others as well, to make it really easy in this kind of what we call hybrid cloud environment to use Azure data centers as your disaster recovery data centers. And of course, as David mentioned, that includes having always-on availability groups span on-prem up into the Azure data centers.
Definitely. Well, Greg, we would like to thank you for presenting at our virtual chapter and for the great presentation going over backups over to Azure. Everyone that's still here on the webinar with us, our next meeting will be May 13th, and we'll have Tim Radney going over knowing backups and knowing recovery, going over both ends of the spectrum for you. And we'll meet at 1 o'clock Eastern Time on May 13th, and we look forward to seeing everybody there.